The background is that all my life I wanted to be a doctor, and I never wanted to be anything else. And in retrospect, I wondered why that was the case. Um, I think part of it is that my grandfather was a physician, and he was killed in Auschwitz when I was 5 months age, and he was idolized by my mother. And in retrospect, I wondered if I wasn't trying to somehow supplant his place in my mother's heart. Um, but as you know, in life, there's many motivations. There's never just one reason why we do something. And so I always wanted to serve humanity. I thought medicine was the good way to do that. And there may have been something as well that my mother used to say to me, as a Jew growing up in Eastern Europe, you never feel too secure. And my mother said, well, as a physician, you always carry your knowledge and your skill with you in your head. So wherever you have to go, you can always find work. So, uh, and there was also, let's face it, the egotistical reasons of status and financial security and all that. So, there's always such a mix that goes into creating who we are and what we do. But I didn't pursue my goal of medicine until later, because decades later, I discovered why not. But really, I was a typical case of ADHD, attention deficit, and I just didn't have the gumption to focus strong enough on the science courses. So I drifted into my natural bent is towards thinking and writing and English and literature and history. So I taught English and English for high school for a few years, and then I realized, no, my calling is to be a physician. So I went to medical school, but by the time I was in medical school, I already had a broader view of the world than most of my classmates, having studied the humanities and so on. And the medical training I received was traditional Western model, very much biologically focused. Western medicine, for all its amazing achievements, and it's not a question of questioning how amazing Western medicine can perform, but it's also very limited in its scope. It does not recognize the body-mind unity, and this is where scientifically it's so interesting, because human beings traditionally, whether you look at Ayurvedic medicine of India or the energy medicine of China or traditional shamanic medical practices throughout the world, the mind-body unity has always been the assumed state. What's interesting is that modern science has more than validated that, and I can talk about that later if you want, but there's a real gap between science and medical practice. So most physicians don't understand the mind-body unity. They don't get it, that the two are not separable. And Western medicine also separates the individual from the environment. So we tend to look upon pathology as biological events happening in an isolated individual. Whereas both spiritually, from a mindfulness perspective and philosophically and scientifically, you cannot separate the individual from the environment. The Buddha said 2,500 years ago, contemplate the interdependent co-arising of all phenomena. The interdependent co-arising of all phenomena. Now, as a family physician, if my eyes were open, I couldn't help noticing that things were interdependent, and that people didn't exist as individuals. They existed in families, multi-generational families. Who got sick and who didn't wasn't accidental. And that diseases weren't just biological events, they were manifestations of a psycho-emotional, spiritual process that showed up in the body, but it didn't originate strictly in the body in a pure physiological sense. So that was one strain where my medical training really allowed me to understand the body, but from a broader perspective, I got to see that it wasn't just the body in an isolated sense. So I was a family physician, which meant that I delivered babies and I looked after dying people. So over the years, I assisted at or attended the delivery of about 1,000 babies. I liked that aspect of my work. And at some point, I was asked to be the medical director of a palliative care unit here in Vancouver. So I was the medical director of the palliative care unit, looking after terminally ill people, dying of cancer usually, but sometimes with neurological diseases or heart disease and so on. And again, I couldn't help but notice that who died early and how they died had a lot to do with what their childhood had been like and what their lives had been like and what their relationship to themselves had been like. And from the mindfulness point of view, what's interesting is that people became much more aware of who they were close to their death than they had been all their lives. And interestingly enough, you wouldn't think this, but some people even were grateful to their illness for bringing them closer to themselves than they ever had been before. I don't recommend it that way of traveling, but if that's what happens, I've seen people express gratitude for that process. So I worked in palliative care and family practice. And then, of course, parallel to that, I had to deal with my own stuff because there I was successful professionally and so on, but I was unhappy. I didn't like life very much. I didn't look forward to getting up in the morning. I was in a stressful marriage. As I like to say, I've been married 8 times to the same woman, and it's been a lot of learning over the years, and I had to deal with a lot of the unhappiness that I was unwittingly generating in my life. So I had to look at the sources of that, the causes of that. At some point, I was dragged kicking and screaming into doing spiritual work, and so that began to inform how I understood life. And then the last 12 years of my medical career was spent in working with addictions, with a highly addicted population here in Vancouver, people dependent on heroin and cocaine and crystal meth and other drugs, alcohol. That was deep learning for me. And if I can just sum it up, the Western medical training gave me the insight into the physiology of the human organism. But then what I learned in the practice of medicine is that that physiology was a manifestation of a life in a context, not simply a biological occurrence. And I had to learn that from my patients, and I had to learn it also through my own healing. And finally, how I got into counseling was very simple. In Canada, the medical system does not pay for people to get psychological counseling. And as I began to notice the connections between people's emotional lives and their physiological illnesses, I began to realize that to help somebody it wasn't enough to prescribe medications or to perform procedures or to refer people to specialists. I had to deal with their emotional lives. But how to do that? The part of Vancouver I was working at wasn't a well-to-do area, so people couldn't afford private counselors. On the one, on the other hand, I could refer them to psychiatrists because medical doctors, psychiatrists are paid for by the medical plan, but most psychiatrists don't have a clue about the mind-body unity. They have a very narrow biological view of mental illness. They see it as all a matter of brain chemicals and genetics. I'm not talking of everybody, but by and large, the profession is like that. So literally, I couldn't refer my clients to counseling to psychiatrists because the average psychiatrist just doesn't know how to do that. So then I had to start counseling them myself, and I learned counseling from my patients. By making a lot of mistakes along the way, of course, but always being curious and always being able to learn. So here I am.
We provide you with the certification and the credentials you need to teach mindfulness in professional settings. I invite you to check out our webpage at teach.mindfulnessexercises.com to learn more about the program, and I look forward to seeing you on the inside.